Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing another genre and subgenre of literature known as Gothic literature. And this is something that actually has its origins in the 18th century, ends up moving forward and becomes extremely popular in the 19th century, and even continues forward into the 20th and really even into the 21st century today. Now, as I said before, this begins in the 18th century, this idea of Gothic literature, with a short story by a man named Horace Walpole called The Castle of Otranto. Okay? And this really begins to set the tone for a new genre of literature that really emerges out of the existing genre called Romanticism. Okay? Romanticism we've talked about in the first part of the history course, so History 1301, we get into this a little bit. The aftermath of this, of course, is what we start to see occur right around 1850 going forward. And Romanticism really starts to look at the idea of human nature and emotions, moves away from the rational and into the supernatural, into metaphysics, into religion, spiritualism, the macabre, that sort of thing. And this is really when we start to see the emergence of the darker side of Romanticism in the form of Gothic literature. Okay? And the themes of Gothic literature, again, start to turn toward the very, very dark aspects of human existence. Okay? So everything from corruption, both in the physical and in the mental sense. Okay? We have decay and disease as being major themes, right? Things that constantly are falling apart, whether they're human beings or structures of sorts. There is certainly a big element of secrecy, right? Very dark secrets, curses, the grotesque and the macabre, as I've said before. We have rotting corpses, we have demonic influence, ghosts, monsters, murder, torture, and the element of medievalism, right? The surroundings tend to kind of mirror or mimic the emotion of what's going on. So you might see a lot of castles, a lot of lightning and thunder, right? Dark forests, catacombs, tombs, dungeons, all these types of things. Okay? So anything that you have been brought up on when it comes to things like the Universal movies, monsters, these types of things, right? The classic aspects of what we think of when it comes to horror tend to go along with what we think of with Gothic literature. Okay? And there's a lot of very famous Gothic authors out there. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But ones that become the most famous during this time period include, of course, Edgar Allan Poe, who is kind of the pinnacle of Gothic literature, right? Just about every one of his stories covers each of the Gothic themes that we discuss here. We have Emily Dickinson, of course, who is a very famous poet. She was a very tragic case of an individual who became shut-in later on in life. Just like Edgar Allan Poe, she went through a series of tragedies in life. Charlotte Bronte and her sister Emily Bronte both became very prominent authors. We have Nathaniel Hawthorne, who starts to look more at the corruption of humanity and, right, humans turning on one another, right, the Scarlet Letter and so forth. We have Bram Stoker, very famous for his introduction of the vampire into Western literature. And, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, okay, very famous for her introduction of the mad scientist trope. And, of course, each one of these authors has contributed a major seminal work to what we've seen. Bram Stoker is the author of Dracula. Okay? Mary Shelley authored Frankenstein. The Scarlet Letter is authored by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Raven is authored, of course, by Edgar Allan Poe, as is The Masque of the Red Death. And Because I Could Not Stop for Death is one of Emily Dickinson's most famous. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what goes into Gothic literature, we can start to look at the subgenre of this. Okay, something that came about really in the aftermath of the American Civil War, right? Something that became popular sometime during Reconstruction and a little bit afterwards, and began to move forward in time and kind of gain traction as its own subgenre, right? Something that we call Southern Gothic literature. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's Gothic literature and Gothic storytelling with the South as a backdrop. Okay? And typically this incorporates elements from history to support the location, the geography, of the South, okay, and typically it involves some reference to the American Civil War or potentially some other historical event that took place. Okay. So we start to see authors who come out of this particular movement, like Ambrose Bierce. Okay, he's a very famous author from the late 19th and early 20th century. Truman Capote, a very famous 20th century author. William Faulkner, who you will see some of his work in this particular class, specifically A Rose for Emily. Toni Morrison, who is a very famous 20th century writer, considering Southern Gothic literature. We have Anne Rice, another one just like Toni Morrison, and Harper Lee as well. Okay. And a few specific examples from each of these authors that we can talk about here. Ambrose Bierce is known for writing a story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And this is a story that was adapted several times and has been adapted several times into various formats. Just as a brief overview, spoilers if you haven't read this. The story is about a Civil War soldier who is captured. He's a spy, basically, and he is about to be hanged from a bridge. Okay? And this is the bridge is called Owl Creek Bridge. He is put up on the scaffold. He has the noose hung around his neck, and just as he is pushed off, he goes through this entire sequence where he experiences the rope breaking, him falling into the water, swimming away down the river, getting away from the soldiers, running all the way home to see his wife and his family and everything. And as soon as he reaches the front gates, he is brought back to reality and realizes that he has imagined his entire escape. And his neck breaks and he is hanging from the bridge. Okay, so this is one of those instances where it becomes something of a literary trope. Okay, and a trope is something where we have an occurrence of some kind in literature that's used and reused constantly, a theme or a device of some kind. And then in this case, it's the idea of it's all a dream or it's all in your imagination. And so this was very famously depicted in a Twilight Zone episode. You can actually see it, I believe, on YouTube if you'd like. But it's just the instance of someone imagining that they can get away from all this, and in reality, he's experienced this entire imagination of escaping within the span of a couple of seconds. In Cold Blood is a very famous true crime novel that was written by Truman Capote, I believe, in the 1950s. And In Cold Blood concerns an actual crime that happened where a man broke into a family's home and very brutally murdered them all with a shotgun. And this was something that became the first instance of the true crime novel taking place specifically in the South in this particular case. But it sets a precedent for the concept of a true crime novel. William Faulkner's story, A Rose for Emily, is one that we'll read in class. I believe it's part of your discussion board, so you can kind of take a look at that in your spare time. Beloved is a very famous story by Toni Morrison. It has to do with a black family trying to survive during Reconstruction. One of the children in the black family is a mentally disabled young woman. And so there's constant, family infighting going on. There's the element of madness that's brought into this. Again, kind of part of that genre of Gothic literature. Anne Rice, of course, is very famous for her vampire chronicles, Interview with the Vampire in particular, the vampire Lestat, right? Those types of characters. Queen of the Damned, I believe, is another one. So she's very famous for writing a lot of the vampire fiction that we see from the 1990s, especially late 80s, early 90s. And of course, with instances like Harper Lee, who you see down here, I don't have it listed, of course, but her book To Kill a Mockingbird falls into the Southern Gothic genre as well, right? We have families with secrets, with the character of Boo Radley, family members who are kind of kept behind closed doors, stuff that's not spoken of. We have race relations that are brought into the mix, so that type of thing. And I included here, it's not something that I can really point to outside of really the comic book genre, but the character and the storyline of Swamp Thing is something that is very specific to the South, Louisiana in particular. The is my favorite comic book of all time, so of course I have to include it here. Created in 1972 by Len Wein, who's a very famous comic book writer. Also created the character of Wolverine, by the way, and a horror illustrator named Bernie Wrightson. They created this character. It's a scientist who's caught in an explosion in a lab down in the South, and the chemical he's working on stimulates plant growth. Okay, and it ends up reconstructing his body from the slime in the swamp, and he becomes this giant mud monster, basically. And elements of the supernatural, the occult, history and the Civil War, ghosts, and all this type of stuff are all brought into the storyline in the series. So again, I have to include it because I would be remiss if I did not, but it's one of my favorites. And of course, other films and TV that incorporate Southern Gothic literature are stuff that we see all the time today. To Kill a Mockingbird, as I've said before, is one very famous example. The 1970s film Deliverance is another one. This kind of incorporates the concept of individuals living off the grid out in the middle of nowhere who are malicious, right? Kind of the idea of the evil hillbilly, so to speak, right? Has a very famous and disturbing scene in that particular film concerning these individuals. But again, the idea of decay and corruption, inbreeding, potentially. And again, this is kind of a demonization by the North of individuals living in the South to a certain extent, right? Not everybody in the South is inbred, okay? But this is an extreme example in that particular case. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, of course, very famous, one of the most famous horror movies ever made. Deals specifically with this as well, right? This evil cannibal family living in the South who are murdering hitchhikers, eating them, carving them up, and all this kind of stuff. A lot of gore and body horror involved in that. The story Sling Blade, right? Very famous Billy Bob Thornton story and film. Won several Academy Awards for that. Involves yet again another instance of an individual with a mental disorder. I believe he's simply just mentally not mental disorder necessarily, but in this case he's a little slow, I guess is the best way I can put it. His character, he's physically and emotionally abused as a child by his family, ends up committing murder and is put into a mental institution, right? And it kind of spirals from there, and the story does. So again, a lot of the family secrets, the dark secrets of the family, again, mental issues going along with that. And another modern example, if you're a fan of the TV show American Horror Story, the third season, Coven, specifically deals with voodoo and witchcraft in the South, I believe specifically in New Orleans. So all these elements come together constantly, time and time again. Again, all the way from the 18th century into the present, right? We see Gothic literature all the time in modern adaptations. Okay, so it's worth looking at any or all of these specific examples that I've given you here. But so that's all I got for you for today when it comes to Gothic and Southern Gothic literature. For those of you who are my students, head on over to the quiz section and take your quiz over this specific lesson. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. I'll see you later.